How we doing out there? Doing okay so far? All right, with the fans on, I need to know that you all can hear me here. Can you hear me okay? All right. I'm going to pause here and there for a little water. Feel free to do the same. Friends, please pray with me. God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. You are our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. For the 4th of July this past week, my family and I went to visit some of our family in the Mad River Valley area of Vermont. And while we were there, we went to the 4th of July parade, which is in Warren, Vermont, with other friends who were there as well as some family. And the day before, we even got to go to the local pond in Warren where the local folks there make their own floats for the parade happening the next day. There's always a theme that the Mad River Valley area chooses for their 4th of July parade, and this year it was the State of the Union. Now, in this little community of Warren, Vermont, they sort of choose their own theme based on the theme. So there's sort of a sub-theme of the parade, and their sub-theme this year was ostrich with its head in the sand. And sure enough, as we were watching people make floats, they were indeed constructing a huge ostrich. So the next morning, very early, we're there with our family and lots of other friends with little kids, and I'm sort of the adult down on the ground chaperoning the getting of the candy, all the candy that's thrown, and helping the kids to not be run over by the floats. And here comes this huge ostrich with a pile of sand in front of it. This is all basically made out of paper and cardboard and glue and duct tape, all very homespun. And there are probably about 20 people carrying it and operating the mechanisms that moved the ostrich's head up and down and around. And at one point it looked right at my kids and then quickly maneuvered its head back into the sand as a trumpeter played an out-of-tune in minor key version of America the Beautiful. A big sign on the front of the float said, "America, it's time to get your head out of the sand." Then, once the ostrich's head was in the sand, a guy with a megaphone asked the crowd, "Is it time for America to get its head out of the sand?" And a roaring yes came back. Then the ostrich would pick up its head and everyone would clap, and he said, "You too can do this." And then the trumpeter played Reveille. So, homemade t-shirts and costumes were plentiful at this parade, and there were librarians spinning library carts with defiant slogans about not banning books and the importance of thinking and reading. There were muscle cars and hard-to-decipher bands and gun rights folks. It was very Vermont in a Main Street, USA kind of way. It was fun, and it was joyful, and yet there was this urgency. There was a sense of coming together that could be felt in the crowd, a real grassroots call to consciousness and awakeness. One homemade t-shirt said, "Don't let this be our last Independence Day." And it felt particularly sobering. So I struggled with the title of this sermon, and at some point I just honestly chose something. What is freedom is the title. Really, what does that look like now? But it could also be, what is patriotism now? Or what the fill in the blank is happening? Or simply frogs in a slowly boiling pot? Or maybe the ostrich with its head in the sand? These all could have been titles. And if Jeremiah titled his sermons, aka his prophecies, he could have used any of those same titles as well. As I said, he was a reluctant priest and prophet to the northern kingdom of Jerusalem, to Judah, as the Babylonian Empire was gaining strength and eating up land and taking over peoples and culture. He came from a priestly family, but when God asked him to step up and take that mantle at a particularly hard time and to say things that were going to be really unpopular, like stop exploiting people, he really didn't think he was up to the task. However, clearly he did. He did step in, and he is now, to this day, one of the major prophets, not just of Judaism and not just of Christianity, but also of Islam. The year when Jeremiah began his work, his preaching and his prophesying was 626 BCE. And he tried for almost 30 years. Judah was sacked in 587 BCE. The whole time that Jeremiah sounded the alarm, trying to get them to wake up, trying to get them to leap out of the simmering water before it boiled, to not keep their head in the sand, he wasn't telling them to build a greater military. He wasn't telling them to elect a king that could fix it all. He wasn't telling them to just be tough guys. He wasn't telling them to just look out for Judah's interest before anyone else's. Instead, Jeremiah said the opposite. He called them back to the Torah, back to the priority of the common good, away from isolationism, away from a first us mentality, away from the exploitation of people and land, away from systematized selfishness masquerading as national sovereignty. And he called them to the core communal values that had made Israel what it was. Freedom, not to do whatever they wanted, but freedom to care for each other in real and practical ways. He reminded them that their greatest defense was to live in the truth of human interdependence in dignity and respect for all. In our passage today, Jeremiah links their ability to save themselves to a call to stop exploiting people and land. As the writing on the wall gets clearer that they would be invaded, the defense he calls them to is righteousness, but righteousness here is summed up as Sabbath keeping. Our understanding sometimes of the Sabbath sort of boils it down, waters it down to something like self-care. But that's not what real Sabbath is. Jeremiah isn't saying take more bubble baths and your country will be okay. Because what the Sabbath is really about is about giving freedom, about giving liberation, about giving rest. The Sabbath is a routinized practice that makes exploitation of people, animals, and land impossible. So here, Jeremiah says, the best way to avoid doomsday is to stop exploiting others. The way to save your country is to take care of everyone and the land in it, rather than squeezing every last ounce of productivity out of people and land for a very short gain. Instead, live in a way that allows all to live. When Christian nationalists and others say that we are a Christian nation because we were founded on Judeo-Christian values, they pretty much leave out the Judeo part. Because in truth, if they included Jewish values, they would be promoting and protecting social safety nets rather than trying to tear them down. If they honored the Jewish part of our supposed Judeo-Christian roots, then we would do a lot better by immigrants and refugees. We would not be in a climate crisis. Women's rights would be protected, and a living wage would be a no-brainer. And their interpretation of Christian really comes down to capitalist values. The interpretation of Christian values here is anything but liberative and freedom-giving for Christian nationalists. It is patriarchal and wholly built on the exploitation of others, especially women, poor people, LGBTQ folks, and Black and brown people. The early followers of Jesus and the letters we read that are written to the early churches, the folks who wrote those in our Bible, none of these people would recognize the platform of Christian nationalism as having anything to do with the life and teachings of Jesus, because it does not. Similarly, I have to think that our founders as a nation would be shocked at where we are at this moment as a nation. That an organized totalitarian movement is masquerading as patriotism and liberty, and that some equate this with Christianity and trace it back to supposed Judeo-Christian roots. Look, friends, we have no Jeremiah to lead us, even if we did have ears to hear. And as progressive people of faith, to be honest, we struggle to find the mic, let alone speak loudly and unapologetically enough to be heard. And yet, the only thing that has pushed back against totalitarianism, the only thing is a coalition of progressive faith voices coming together. A progressive faith coalition refusing to give up, refusing to cede actual freedom and faith to those deceptively using those labels, only instead to reify their systems of exploitation for power and for greed. The only thing that has stopped that is a coalition of progressive faith voices, and that is our superpower. It's deeply communal, and it's always multi-faith. Because even if we have no Jeremiah, we have each other. We have other progressive faith siblings in this community and beyond, where together we can refuse to be intimidated into complacency. We have a long road ahead of us from now until the upcoming election, and we all know that who knows what that road is going to look like after that. But we have this time now. And rather than wishing it away, rather than numbing out because it's too much and life is fraught, we have a window of time to reclaim the true meaning of three key things: faith, patriotism, and freedom. Faith that reclaims the heart of its ethos, which is always about the common good. Patriotism that reclaims a government of the people, by the people, for the people, as opposed to a government of the people, by and for a few. And freedom that reclaims the truth that our freedom is always bound up with each other, and that none of us are free until all of us are free. Our call now, maybe more than any other time in our lifetime, is to live as out loud and as unified as possible. As a progressive body of faith, our job is to unapologetically let the teachings of the prophets and the life and the teachings of Jesus embolden us to refuse to put our heads in the sand and to work together, come hell or high water, to stand for truth and for love. Our job, our call now, is to be that tree planted by the stream with so many other trees planted by the stream, to realize that our roots are connected and working together, and to stand, and to stand, and to stand. Amen.